Welcome to the Raid Finder Guide for the Underhold, the third wing of the Siege of Orgrimmar. The first boss is Malkorok, Garrosh's right-hand man. This fight is a very healing-intensive fight with a very cool healing mechanic attached to it. Right at the start of the fight, Malkorok will expel a foul miasma that prevents actual healing from being done. Instead, all healing will cause a damage absorption shield to begin stacking up to 100% of the player's individual HP. The strength of the shield can be seen by the color of the buff on players. Green means the shield is at or close to full, yellow, at or slightly above half, or red for close to being gone. Healers should try to stack this shield quickly at the start of the fight, blowing big healing cooldowns right off the bat. As far as abilities go, Malkorok has several key things to watch out for. He will cause a stacking debuff on tanks that increases their damage taken, and they should swap at around 12 to 13 stacks, or as the off-tank stacks fall off. He will also periodically knock players into the air, doing very little actual damage to them other than causing fall damage that will be applied to the healing shield. He will also periodically spawn puddles of Shaw energy that after a few seconds will explode for a huge amount of damage on the raid. To avoid this, one player per puddle needs to stand in it to absorb the damage. This can be difficult to communicate in Raid Finder. Though more than one person in each puddle is redundant, 3 or 4 people standing in it is still better than none, so it's better to err on the side of caution and stand in it anyways if you aren't sure if anyone else is. Malkorok will also periodically use an ability called Arcing Smash, which is a large physical damage cone attack in a random direction. Simply move out of it when it occurs. However, it is important to remember where he hits with these abilities, as after his third smash, he will use an ability called Breath of Yasarj, which is an extremely damaging attack that strikes all of the areas previously struck by his Arcing Smash. It is extremely useful to have an experienced player place raid markers where the smashes strike, to better keep track. Malkorok also has a stacking rage resource that, upon reaching 100, causes him to enter a blood rage, where he absorbs the miasma and begins attacking for a massive amount of damage, split between all players struck. All players need to immediately stack on top of the current tank to split the damage out evenly so that the tanks are not one-shotted by this ability. He will also, during this phase, apply a dot on random players that deals a fair amount of damage to them, and therefore needs to be dispelled. However, upon being dispelled, the dot will blast out a damaging AoE to all players within 8 yards. To handle this, players who get the debuff need to run out of the stack so they can be dispelled, then run back in. During this time, the miasma is gone, so healing can top up the raid of any HP that might have been lost during the miasma phase. Malkorok will use 5 rage per attack, and once his rage is depleted, he will expel the miasma and the fight will continue as before. Players need to be sure to have at least one person standing in each Shaw puddle when they spawn. Avoid the Arcing Smashes and the ensuing breath, and remember to stack for the blood rage phase, and Malkorok will go down without too much trouble.
The second boss in the Underhold isn't actually a boss per se, but rather a massive mob encounter called the Spoils of Pandaria. This fight takes some preparation before the pull, where the raid needs to be split as evenly in 2 as possible. 1 tank, 3 healers, and half the DPS needs to go through 1 gate, and 1 tank, 3 healers, and the rest of the DPS needs to go through the other. Most groups will divide the raid up by group number. Listen in raid chat to the person setting up the groups, and check your group number as shown above your character portrait and go where specified. There are 2 phases to this fight, the Mogu phase and the Mantid phase. The group entering the gate on the right as you come in will deal with the Mogu first, while the other group deals with the Mantid first. After one section has been cleared, the large gate nearby will open and players will move on to the next room, where they will then deal with the other phase, either the Mogu or the Mantid respectively. Players defeat the encounter by opening boxes around the room and killing the adds that are inside. The larger the box, the more dangerous the add, but the more credit is given to clearing the side. Not all the boxes must be opened, just enough to charge up a lever that opens the next section, as indicated by a large energy bar in the lower middle section of a player's screen. Only tanks should open the boxes, as if other players open them, it can lead to a loss of control of the adds, which often leads to a wipe. There are 2 huge boxes in each section, and these boxes should be opened first. In Raid Finder, you are limited to the number of boxes that can be opened at once, and no other boxes can be opened with one of the huge boxes opened until the mob inside is dead. So if you're confident in your tanking ability, you can open up 2 other nearby smaller boxes before opening the big one, and then fight all 3 mobs at once. Once the 2 huge boxes are opened and the mobs killed, the tank should move slowly around the room, opening as many boxes as allowed until the energy meter is filled, and the next section opens. As far as mechanics to the fight goes, most are relatively simple and merely need to be avoided or healed through. On the Mantid side, the mobs in the huge boxes will deal continuous AoE damage and periodically throw a stack of bombs on a random player. The player needs to run to a clear area that the raid will not be visiting in the next 30 seconds, and use the special action button that will appear to throw the bombs on the ground. Once on the ground, the bombs should be avoided until they explode on their own 30 seconds later. Other effects that are used by the mobs from the medium and small boxes include gusting windstorms that should simply be avoided, as well as bubbling pools of amber on the ground, which again should just not be stood in. Mantid Amber Priests will summon more Mantid occasionally, and the tank needs to pick them up. And occasionally, some of the Mantid mobs will enrage, increasing the damage they deal to the tank. Healers and tanks need to be prepared for this. On the Mogu side, the mobs from the 2 huge crates will summon Mogu statues that will spread around the room and do cone attacks in random directions. They do not need to be tanked, just killed and avoided. The boss deals more damage for each statue alive, so DPS should split between killing them and killing the boss. The boss will also AoE that needs to be simply healed through. Out of the medium boxes, animal golems will sometimes emerge, and these drop healing pools in the ground called Crimson Reconstruction, which they, and all other mobs, need to be moved out of quickly, as it does an incredible amount of healing. They will also summon 2 beams of red light called Matter Scramble, that will require at least 1 player to stand in each beam. If players do not, when the beam fades, it will deal a large amount of raid-wide damage. Other effects to watch out for are Torment, a stacking dot effect on random players that needs to be dispelled if it starts reaching high stacks. Do not dispel it quickly, however, as it will simply jump to another player when dispelled, though its stacks will reset. Another effect is Mogu Runes of Power, a ground effect that will increase the damage of all enemy mobs standing in it, and as the tank, simply move the mobs out to quickly reduce their damage. Both sides must fully clear their first rooms before either one can move on to the second, and the boss fight ends only when both sides have cleared their second room. Players can use the hooks near the side entrances of the room to return to the above walkway and swap sides to help out the opposite side in an emergency. Make sure to open the boxes properly, move the mobs out of beneficial ground effects, and avoid harmful ground effects yourself, and then you can collect your spoils. The final boss in the Underhold is Thok the Bloodthirsty, a massive devil soar. Thok fights similar to a dragon, dealing frontal cone attacks and having a tail smash as well, so players should never stand directly behind or in front of the boss. He deals intense raid damage, and therefore the raid should stack on his side during the boss fight to make healing easier. Thok does a frontal cone attack that applies a stacking debuff that increases the damage taken by the tank. Throughout this fight, this attack and debuff will change, however handling it will not. Simply taunt off at 3 stacks. As with all frontal cone attack debuffs, the off tank must not stand with the main tank, and upon switching, move quickly out of the way. Thok will also be roaring periodically, which deals a fair amount of raid-wide damage and will interrupt spellcasting. Do not be casting when this goes off. In Raid Finder, at 80% health, Thok will enter a blood frenzy and will no longer need to be tanked. Instead, he will focus on random raid members and attempt to chase them down and devour them. He will deal immense damage to all players in front of him at this time, and therefore players who are focused need to be careful and attempt to kite him down the hallway towards the entrance of the room, or straight back to the end of the room, carefully avoiding moving him through the raid group, as he will kill anyone in front of him, regardless of whether he is focused on them or not. Ranged DPS should try and stay on Thok at this time. When he enters the Blood Frenzy, a Korkron Jailer will spawn at the back of the room, which needs to be picked up and tanked, and melee DPS need to assist in killing this ad. Upon death, clicking on his body will give a key buff to the first player who clicks. This player needs to then right-click and open one of the cages around the room, freeing the friendly ads within. A few seconds after this ad has been freed, Thok will focus on the main leader of the ads, rush to him, and devour him. which will end his blood frenzy and the fight will continue as before, with a few changes, depending on which ad is freed. The Sarok ad should be freed first, and they will help DPS Thok briefly before dying. Thok's Cone Attack will now become an armor-reducing stacking debuff, and random players will begin gaining a stacking dot effect on them. It is far too difficult to dispel everyone with the exception of using a Priest's Mass Dispel, and therefore healers should focus on those who have multiple stacks of the dot and dispel them first. At 55%, Thok will enter the Blood Frenzy again, a jailer will spawn, and it will be handled just as before. This time, the Jinyu prison should be opened, and they will apply a large amount of healing to the entire raid before Thok will focus on their leader and devour him. Now his Frontal Cone Attack will apply a stacking Frost debuff that will freeze the target, stunning them permanently at 5 stacks, unless they are DPS'd free from the entrapping ice. Random players will also be afflicted by this debuff, and if it reaches 5 stacks, they should be also DPS'd free. He will enter his final Blood Frenzy at 30%, and it is handled again the same as before. The final cage will be opened containing the Yongol prisoners, and they will buff the raid with a fire buff that causes additional damage to the boss. If Bloodlust and Heroism was not blown at the start of the fight, it should be blown now. This time, Thok's Frontal Cone Attack will apply a stacking fire dot on the main tank, and fire patches will be erupting all over the room. Stacking will be impossible in this part, and the raid should spread out and DPS down Thok as best as possible while avoiding the fire patches. The primary cause for wipes on this fight is DPS kiting Thok incorrectly during his Blood Frenzy. Make sure to have some distance from him and position yourself in a way that enables easy kiting should he focus on you. Stack with the group otherwise during the other phases, excluding the final one, avoid patches in the final phase, kill the jailers, and open the proper cells in the right order, and the mighty dinosaur will fall at your feet.